Welcome back, AP. Welcome back, Tool. Welcome back to your flip classroom where we're talking about the effects of European exploration, right? Now, this is going to be a little bit of a weird flip because I kind of have to Frankenstein two old ones together because I have to sub first period, which is disgusting. I know. So now the big thing about it, though, in general, is that I wanted to go ahead and record at least 10 to 12 minutes of this flip so you can kind of understand what's going on. And then I'm going to clip in a flip where I'm going to introduce the Reformation starting in Europe during the 1500s, right? Well, actually, even starting even before that. But the thing about it, though, that I wanted to kind of like jump off on is right where we left off in our last flip, right? We were talking about the commercial revolution, right? We were talking about this kind of during class as well. We reviewed it a little bit, talking about like kind of just more stuff, more money, right? More stuff, more trade, more money, more growth, larger economic base, right? And a lot of this relates to the Columbian Exchange, which Inyasha did a great job of describing when we were in class, talking about Eastern Hemisphere, Western Hemisphere. Y'all got stuff, they've got stuff, and they're going to switch, right? And then she also mentioned, of course, that the Eastern Hemisphere is going to bring over those diseases that the Western Hemisphere was never exposed to, causing a massive amount of death and destruction in this area, and how basically the Europeans were the ones that really won out on that Columbian Exchange, right? We talked about potatoes. Yes, potatoes. Everyone loves potatoes.
Potato, potato, potato joy. Potato time for the potato boy. Potatoes for all to enjoy. Come on and celebrate with the potato boy.
And I know especially Reagan Harmon loves potatoes, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, going into it, is you got to understand this concept. And I wanted to start on this slide just so you know that you need to kind of be able to expand and discuss the commercial revolution because it is going to be a part of one of the short answers on your test, right? You just need to know that more workers are going to be needed, so feudalism is going to lose efficiency. You're going to need to talk about more cash is available, so that means that businesses are growing. Now, let's go ahead and talk about that facet, though, right? If the commercial revolution, if the Columbian Exchange is creating larger amounts of cash that are available for people to actually use to start companies and things like that, that means you're going to see the rise of these companies, right? So the effects are the biggest effect of the commercial revolution, one of the biggest effects of the commercial revolution that's going to kind of start up in like the late 1500s is the rise of these things known as companies. Now, you might actually refer to them as what's known as joint stock companies, right? Go ahead and say that with me. Joint stock companies. Say it again one more time. Joint stock companies. They're very, very important. Go ahead and jot that down, right? So the thing about it, though, is we could talk about a variety of different areas if we wanted to talk about all the companies. We could talk about the Virginia Company founding Jamestown. We could talk about the West Indies Company over in like the Caribbean. We could talk about a lot of these, right? But the thing that we're going to focus on is using India and the Spice Islands as our situation for the rise of these different companies, right? And they're the best indicator for the rise of like the Dutch Golden Age. They're the best indicators for the rise of like England's growth in like very, very large intercoastal economics and things like that. So let's go ahead and talk about where we last left off when we were talking about India, right? Because we haven't been back to India in quite some time. The last that we heard when we were talking about India is that Portugal was in India all along the coastline, reaping massive amounts of area or like things from the spice trade, right? They were making deals and agreements with these different local, these local leaders in India, and they're creating a very large trade system that goes around the coast of India, right? Now we also know though that nearby that the Dutch were in the Spice and Java Islands, right? The Moluccas Islands. They were actually over near like Java and also near the Spice Islands, growing spices, growing heavy amounts of coffee as well. They also were killing and harvesting these animals, the Dutch were, and they were, because these things right here are called civets cats, and civets cats have these glands in them where they basically, the Dutch would like hunt them, trap them, and kill them, and the glands would be used to make musk perfume, which is really gross, right? So like now, but actually, interestingly enough, civets cats have lived in Java for like hundreds of thousands of years. People in Java actually have like used the civets cats to make a certain kind of coffee for a really long time. But we'll talk about that in class. Now, the big thing about it though, in general, but like they're cute. Like, why do you have to hurt them, Dutch? What the heck, man? So the biggest thing about it though, in general, is that looking at India, looking at the situation we have in our hands, looking at Portugal being on the coastline, looking at the Dutch being in the Spice Islands, what's going down here? We've got Europeans meddling around in Asian affairs, right? And we've got them sitting behind these different local leaders, and we've got them making agreements with them, which means the local leaders are making profit and money out the gate. Well, the thing about it is, Europeans are not going to just sit on that, right? The thing about India is that India at this time period is not a coalesced country, right? They are not a country with a capital city ruled over by one monarch and ruled over by one government. They are a mishmash of different provinces and of falling empires, right? There's these large groups of people that have taken over India at any one point in history, like the Mughals or the Ashoka Empire, and every single time they would grow and then recede, little local princes would start popping up all over the place, right? So these different little provincial states were actually led by different local Indian princes. I'm flipping, please give me a minute. All right, so like the big thing about it though in general is that these local provinces were led by Rajas, right? So go ahead and write that down. Raj, R-A-J-S. A Raj is a local Indian prince that can probably be convinced, subdued, or kind of entered into a trade agreement with by these Europeans to be able to collect the resources that they have inside of their province, right? So the thing about it is the Europeans are going to realize that India is a divided country led by these different local princes. And this is really, really going to set up some scheming ideas in their minds, right? So you're going to see the rise of these different things known as the companies, right? Specifically known as the East India Companies, right? So the feud over these provinces in India, the feud over these different areas in India by these different like groups of Europeans, right? The Dutch are going to realize this and they're going to be like, wait, how do I convince the Raj in this province to stop trading with Portugal and trade with us instead? How do I convince the Raj from that province to stop trading with England and trade with us instead, right? So the feud over these provinces in India and the feud over these agreements with these different Raj leaders is going to lead to the establishment of sovereign trade companies, right? Now, sovereign is a key word when you're describing these countries or these companies, right? Sovereign means not controlled directly by a government, right? It means it's a company that exists in international waters and is not subject to the laws of their governing body, right? And these companies all had the same name. They were called the East India Companies, right? And as you can see right here, every single country started popping up their own, right? This right here is the Dutch East India Company, right? These literally are their brand names. Where the word brand name comes from is literally from when these early companies came along and they would use hot irons to brand their product on wooden casks and things like that. So if you ever saw this symbol branded into a cask of spices, it's because the Dutch had worked with a Raj somewhere in India and then actually began harvesting and stealing a lot of the crops and a lot of the spice trade out of that area. Same thing. This one is the English East India Company, right? That brand was actually put into cask. And then also the very, very dinky one, the one that was started later and also folded first, is the French East India Company, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is these East India companies are not subject to the laws of their local governing bodies, but they're an element of that commercial revolution because the way they work is a lot of merchants and these merchant guilds realize, well, wait, hey, I have one boat, right? And if I send my boat out and it collects goods and comes back, I make money. That's great. But a lot of these other people are also like, well, wait a minute. I have one boat. If I send that boat out and it sinks, I'm done for, right? So the joint stock element of these companies is basically a bunch of Dutch merchants or a bunch of English merchants or a bunch of French merchants got together and said, how about we do this? How about we mush all of our boats into one large fleet? And then if I give one boat out of these 20, however much money the company makes, I get 1/20th of that profit, right? Boom! Now we got the rise of stocks and stock exchange and the stock market, right? So the commercial revolution is going to lead to the rise of these sovereign trade companies, these East India companies that are going to grow and expand their influence throughout the Indian Ocean, right? Now, this is very, very important that you understand, right? You got to know this stuff. It's very, very important. You got to know it going forward, right? And they're going to begin a massive race all over India to try and grab up and gobble up these different provinces and convince these Rajas to trade with them. This is going to lead to wars. This is going to lead to violence. This is going to lead to also different Indians being pulled into these conflicts. It's going to lead to a very, very kind of ridiculous situation going forward, right? And so as you can see, the British and the Dutch East India Companies are going to begin that race first, right? The British East India Company was founded, I believe, in 1600. The Dutch East India Company was founded in 1602, and they're going to start racing to see if they can get to India fastest. The Dutch are going to establish a very strategic point in Cape Town, South Africa, which is actually down at the base of South Africa, right down here. And Cape Town is actually still a modern-day town today as well. A big thing, or a modern-day city today as well. And also the Dutch influence there is going to lead to the racial makeup of that area as well in South Africa. Now, we'll talk about that later on when we get to imperialism, and we'll really expand on that when we get into the Boer Wars and when we get into the Europeans basically stealing the continent of Africa from other Africans. and this thing called the Scramble for Africa, which is one of the most screwed up periods in all of history, and one of the biggest things that I feel is very important to talk about because not a lot of people know about it, and you need to know that Europeans started right here, starting with the Dutch, making bases, and starting with the Portuguese, moving around here and beginning the slave trade in Africa, are going to begin their conquest of Africa, and it's going to lead to some terrible, dysfunctional things going forward in terms of their impressing of their values onto African people, which is so screwed up, right? Now, the big thing about it as well is it's not just the Africans, it's the Indians as well. It's all of East Asia. And this is going to lead, by the British and Dutch, are going to begin a trend of taking over Asian states, taking over African states, and beginning to dominate Southeast Asia by the mid-1650s, right? Now, the example that I have right here of the French East India Company is that one's going to pop up a little bit later, and it's going to come in, and it's also going to fold the soonest, right? But now, we are leaving exploration behind, and we are now moving into the growth of the Reformation and the growth of religious wars that are going to be breaking out in Europe. Now, what we're going to be doing really quickly is we're going to be jumping around our timeline again. So we're about to be jumping backwards all the way back into the Middle Ages again, talking about what's going on in the church and in this environment going into the Reformation. And again, I hate that this happened, but I have to sub, so I've got to go do that real quick. But I'll see y'all soon, okay? Y'all watch the rest of this flip, and I'll talk to y'all about it soon in class, all right? Just kidding. I decided to just go ahead and record this first period anyway, right? I'm actually over in Miss Ursa's class subbing right now, so we're going to keep it short, sweet, to the point, and we're going to start talking off about the Reformations and the religious wars in Europe, right? So we just finished up talking about the exploration movement that was going on in Europe during the 1500s, 1600s, and then going into the establishment of the commercial revolution, as well as the East India companies that are going to start popping up in ancient India, or not ancient, but in pre-societal or pre-monarchical India, right? So we're seeing the growth of large economics. We're seeing the growth of all these different things happen in the 1500s and 1600s during European history, but unfortunately we have to jump backwards and go all the way back to the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and start talking about its influence on the church, right? So the big thing about it, though, going into it, starting the second half of this unit, is now moving into the Reformation. You have to understand the state of the church in the 16th century, right? So the 16th century, aka the 1500s, coming off during the high Renaissance period, right? Remember, what is our hang our hat on it kind of date? Our big hang our hat on it kind of dates that we have right now is 1492 is the beginning of the Spanish expeditions to North and South America, and then also 1508 to 1512 is Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right? Well, right around that time period, late 1400s, going into the 1500s, the state of the church was still very, very intense, right? The populace of Europe, even though the Renaissance is going on, is still deeply pious, right? So when you're looking at the entire expanse and understanding of church and church life in Europe during this time period, you have to understand completely and totally that the Renaissance didn't affect normal people, right? A lot of historians actually argue that the Renaissance never even really happened, that it was just a simple economic revolution that actually occurred in the upper classes of Europe. But the thing about it is the regular people of Europe, the smiths, the serfs, the vassals, the people that lived on noble lands, weren't really affected by the Renaissance in a big humanistic thought process kind of way, right? So they're still very deeply pious, still going to church mass every single day, and especially going on Wednesdays and Sundays as well, right? The big thing that you need to understand as well, though, is however, even though these ideas are not eking their way down into the regular populace of Europe yet, you have to understand that criticism about the church's wealth and excess is on the rise, right? And everything in European history moves in waves, right? Everything moves in waves. It starts in a certain class and then kind of waves its way down into the lower classes. It starts in a certain country and then waves its way over into the rest of them, right? It's all different trends that actually begin to affect people on a personal day-to-day basis, right? And in those upper classes, in those noble classes, in those wealthier classes, you're seeing the growth of written criticisms of the church, right? And there's being large criticisms about the power of the Pope, the excessive amount of wealth, the use of papal funds, and it's becoming a big kind of talking point in courts and in court life, right? And the events of the Middle Ages really damaged the reputation of the church in a very large way, right? The thing about it is the Black Death is going to damage the effectiveness of the church because people are going to try and figure out a religious question to this tragedy, right? Wars and large-scale wars like the 100 Years' War and the War of the Roses are going to damage the ability for the church to properly regulate large-scale war that's actually going on between nobles and noble families. So the thing about it is with the events of the Middle Ages damaging that reputation of the church, you would think, does the Renaissance come along and help solidify the idea of the church? Does it help solidify the Catholic Church? It actually made it worse, right? The Renaissance began to expose further cracks in the foundation of the church during this time period, right? It began to expose really large issues that were going on during this time period in the church of like in Europe. So the Renaissance not helping is going to lead to this Reformation status, right? So looking and going forward, you're seeing the growth of art, you're seeing the growth of economics, you're seeing the growth of written examples of criticisms of the church. And had the Reformation already started? Now, this is a really, really good question that I always like to kind of mess around with a little bit, right? And also, this is going to be a short answer question on your test as well. And the Reformation already kind of began, right? Like, so a lot of people, when they study the Reformation, they say, oh, it didn't start until Martin Luther does his thing in 1517 and writes 95 Theses, right? By the way, if you don't already know who Martin Luther is, you should probably go like look him up and stuff like that. It is important to know who he is going forward. It's just somebody that you should have already known about, right? So the big thing about it, though, in general, is he was just kind of a much later player, and he caused the cataclysmic change in the church. But a lot of historians argue that the Reformation began actually as soon as the 1300s, right? So the Reformation had already kind of started due to the fact that, like, the conciliar movement was on the rise, right? So this is a big thing. Some of these things on this list you do know, some of these things on this list you don't know, right? So the big thing about it is, let's start off with the one that you don't know, the conciliar movement, right? Which actually began in the 1300s. The conciliar movement was a criticism of the church, started by a philosopher that we'll talk about in about 2 seconds on another slide. The conciliar movement was this idea that a council of cardinals should actually rule over the church rather than just one strict pope, right? They wanted to avoid an absolute monarchical idea. They wanted to avoid like a very, very large figurehead of the church that was able to make decisions based on their own want and needs, right? So when we look at it, the conciliar movement wanted to avoid people like Julius II, right? Jumping down to the bottom of the list, warrior popes like Julius II are what the conciliar movement was trying to avoid. Julius II was like a very, very large figure in the sense of trying to expand the papal states. He looked at the church as more of a political facet. He looked at it as well as an economic money-gaining apparatus, right? The lives of popes in general during this time period are also gaining steam and leading to more people being like, maybe there should be a council that actually rules over us. This is also expanded on in Sir Thomas More's The Utopia as well. Sir Thomas More's The Utopia believes that the island of the Utopia should be ruled with strict Catholic ideals. But the thing about it is also believe that a large council of cardinals with a figurehead church figure at the top should be allowed to help rule over the entire church, right? Erasmus and his ideas of the praise of folly are going to lead to people questioning the church because he's making fun of Julius II, talking junk about the way that the church functions, saying that church should not be a checklist into life, that we should be able to read the Bible for ourselves, and advocating for the actual translation of the Bible into Greek. And he actually comes along and publishes this right after Martin Luther had already started, but his ideas in the praise of folly had been written for about 20 years before Martin Luther. And the other interesting thing, too, is he actually knew Martin Luther, met him, went to Rome with him, and stuff like that. And so the other thing, too, going into it, also, by the way, this list is not in order in any way. It's just a list of examples of ideas that we talked about already. The Great Western Schism was another big one, where there were multiple popes at one point, where there at one point were 4 different popes all existing at the same time, and countries were choosing them based on allegiance. The donation of Constantine being discovered to be a forgery. Again, very important, by Lorenzo Valla, right? Lorenzo Valla discovering that document not actually being factual, not actually being true, that document showed that this whole idea that the church is a papal authority and as a figurehead ruling over the western half of the Roman Empire that had already fallen wasn't actually a real document, right? So the thing about it is, it's like all of these things are like eggs that were laid by a chicken, right? Like, so like, and the only thing we needed was Martin Luther, you know, this guy right here, this German monk who was actually kind of nuts in his own little way, to come along and hatch those eggs, right? People had began to really judge the church. People had began to really see the dysfunction in the church and the political growings of the church at this time. Now, this is a quick disclaimer that needs to be put out there as well. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the Catholic Church. No one is saying there's anything wrong with the Catholic Church. We're only saying that there were some issues and dysfunction during the 1500s, and following the Reformation period and this thing known as the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church will actually re-solidify itself and become a very, very large and very good thing existing in society, right? But the thing about it is that other people inside of the Catholic Church structure were damaging the way that it functioned, right? It wasn't the faith, it was the figures that were leading it, right? And people were beginning to call them out, right? Erasmus, Sir Thomas More and all these other figures, right? Martin Luther, like I said, is going to come and incubate these ideas and grow it into a full-fledged Reformation, though, right? So going into it as well, you have to understand that even though Martin Luther was there that hatched all these eggs, these different ideas, these different criticisms of the church, there were earlier reformers that even came before Martin Luther that were there around almost nearly 100 years before that he was, right? Well, one big one, for example, is Marsilius de Padua, which this is actually not a real picture of him. Marsilius de Padua actually was bald on top of his head. I don't know where I got this picture. I can't even remember. I'm going to have to look it up. I think it might be Petrarch, actually. Now, the thing about it in general, though, is the Marsilius of Padua was the very first person to actually write a very long diatribe saying that the celestial power or the formation of the Pope by the heavens itself isn't actually factual according to Scripture, right? The idea that, like, the king or, like, the Pope exists like a king in this realm is not something that is based in Scripture. It was something based in kind of canon tradition and the growing power of the popes at the time. His criticism of the power of the Pope is going to help lead to that conciliar movement, right? Another one that comes along a little bit later is an English priest, right, who shows up. His name is John Wycliffe, right? John Wycliffe pops up is a very, very famous figure, and his writings are actually discovered after he had already died, right? So the thing about it is John Wycliffe died a Catholic priest, never abandoned Catholicism, died as a Catholic, was buried as a Catholic in a Catholic cemetery. His writings were then discovered after he had already passed away and already been buried for over 30 years, right? So his writings actually said criticisms of the church and its wealth, right? Started criticizing the wealth of these big ceremonies, started criticizing the amount of money that priests were making, started criticizing the just absolute exuberant amount of money that was coming into the church, and he's criticizing it based on the idea that the church is supposed to function in the essence of poverty, right? It's supposed to function in the essence of the idea of like making enough money to survive and save souls rather than making money for itself, right? John Wycliffe, when these actual writings would be discovered, he also tried to translate the Bible into English, which is another big thing as well. The big thing, though, is when his writings were discovered, his body was then dug up, burned, and then thrown into the woods, right? And literally his body was basically excommunicated post-mortem, right? Which is crazy. So, like, as you can see, the church is beginning to pick up on these criticisms as well, and is starting to try and, like, get out in front of them. Remember on our test, we talked about, like, literally Pope Leo X, actually, his papal bull on printing was basically talking about how he wanted to control the different ideas coming out of the church during that time period, and how the printing press was going to be another big thing that is going to help lead to this Reformation. You should probably jot that down back on that list earlier, is like this idea that the printing press is going to help catalyze all these things dramatically forward, right? And another guy is a man by the name of Jan Hus, who you could argue is the very first successful Protestant reformer, right? Jan Hus was a Czech priest, right? Czech or Bohemian, depending on who you're asking at this time period, right? Czech, just so you know, is not spelled C-H-E-C-K, it's spelled C-Z-E-C-H, right? So a Czech priest that is actually of Bohemian descent, and he would have lived in what is now what was during this time the Holy Roman Empire, right? And so as a Czech priest, he's the very first Protestant reformer because he's the very first person to try and break away and create his own church, right? He actually was the very first person to translate the Bible into a different language. He translated it into Czech, right? He also is going to begin to accrue followers known as Hussites, right? And another big thing is he's going to look down on the church, and he's going to advocate for the growth of new churches. He's going to advocate for vernacular Bibles. He's going to advocate for people actually understanding Scripture on their own. Now, this is not going to lead to some very good things. He's going to end up on the radar of the Catholic Church, right? And at the Council of Constance is a meeting that was called where they said to Jan Hus, hey, big fella, come in and have a meeting with us. Come in and have a meeting with us and discuss your ideas. We promise you no harm will come to you, right? And Jan Hus, of course, arrives at the Council of Constance in the late, I believe, it's the early 1400s or late 1300s. I'll have to double check. And then at that meeting, he was then put on trial by an inquisition, excommunicated, and burned at the stake for his ideas, right? That's insane, right? So as you can tell, the church is becoming very, very aware of these criticisms and very, very aware of the growing dissent that is actually happening amongst their priests, right? So going forward even further, after the death of Jan Hus, the thing about it is what some of you are probably thinking to yourself, well, Mr. Terry, what happened to the Hussites? Where'd they all go? So they lingered around for about 100 years, and then they eventually died out because they were in hiding so well that they kind of hid until they died, right? The thing about it in general, though, is we have discovered some Czech translated versions of the Bible and some Hussite Bibles that are actually kind of floating around out there in the mist, right? Now, the church, though, also is even going to begin to violate rules that they made up, right? Now, in the sense of the Benedictine rules, right? So the thing that you need to understand about the Benedictine rules is that what they are is a set of rules written by Saint Benedict, right? Saint Benedict was a monk that was actually alive during the 6th century, right? So that's the 6th century is going to be 500s, like not BC, AD. That's ridiculous. How could he be alive during BC? That's the dumbest thing I've ever written. This doesn't say BC, it should be AD, right? So he is establishing the rules of church officials, right? So St. Benedict thought that there needed to be a regulated way that monks and nuns and priests were actually trained to become higher church figures, right? Now, just to give you a heads up, if you were becoming a pope in the Catholic Church, you were starting out as a monk, right? You were starting out as a monk, and you were going to work your way up through the entire hierarchy, become a cardinal, become a bishop, and eventually, hopefully, become a bishop, become a cardinal, and eventually, possibly work your way up to pope, right? So all people that would one day become pope had to follow the Benedictine rules at one point or another. And these rules established different ideas about like how to actually form like proper like functionality. The ideas of vows of silence, right? Vows of labor. That's why the Benedictine rules is what led to priests or monks sitting down and translating or copying versions of the Bible in vows of silence, right? They had labor they had to complete every single day. They had to pray a certain number of times a day. They had to fast every now and again as well, right? You have to understand that these Benedictine rules regulated the existence of monks, and they were supposed to lead their lives in an impoverished manner, right? So the thing about it is these rules are then going to be changed a little bit, and in the 12th and 13th centuries, 3 key new rules would be added to the Benedictine rules, and that's the ideas of chastity, poverty, and obedience to the church leader or to the pope, right? Which sounds a little bit fishy, right, when we talk about obedience to the church leader, but the poverty element and the chastity element are very, very important, right? The ideas of priests living like pure lives, and then also the ideas of poverty, not trying to gain money, but actually trying to lead a life that is considered, like in a pauper sense, poorer, but you are saving the souls of others, right? Only having enough to survive on, not being out there to gain as much money. Well, as we know, going into the Renaissance, the Sistine Chapel don't look too much like poverty to me, right? Like, so like St. Peter's Basilica, when Michelangelo slaps a dome on top of it, doesn't seem too impoverished to me. Also, our chastity thing is getting violated as well, because Alexander VI, one of the popes that drew the line on the line of demarcation with the Treaty of Tordesillas, had an illegitimate son named Caesar Borgia that actually Machiavelli is going to write The Prince about, right? So the thing about it in general is the church and a lot of church figures are beginning to violate these rules, right? Did they violate these rules? It's an emphatic yes, right? So, and again, it's not the faith, it's the people that were in charge, right? And also during this time period, let's go like kind of put things into context. It's the Middle Ages. 4% of people can read and write, right? These people are taking advantage of their power and using their intellectual prowess to take advantage as well, right? The faith, nothing wrong with it. The figures, there was something wrong with them, right? So the thing about it, though, going into it as well, is there's a lot of funny little crazy rules, too, in the Benedictine rules that I like to talk about. How, like, for example, monks apparently had to, like, sit and, like they had to sleep all the time in their habits and stuff like that, so they could be, like, ready to hop up and, like, actually preach at any moment. They also had to keep a light on at all times. They could never sleep in the complete darkness. They weren't allowed to eat hooved animals and stuff like that. So the thing about it in general, though, is you're going to, because of the actions of these popes, because of the actions of some of these priests, going to see the pop-up and growth of widespread anti-clericalism, right? Anti-clericalism is the concept of the opposition to clerical figures, to church figures, to priests, monks, and nuns, right? Anti-clericalism is going to become basically an idea where it's going to become an open forum in a lot of different European villages, in a lot of the European cities, and amongst the European nobles, and also amongst some of the other European merchants, of kind of looking at their church officials and their clerics and kind of criticize them, right? And so you're going to see the growth of like engravings like this one, where you're seeing like a wolf in a monk's clothing, right? This is an engraving that actually came out in the early 1500s. And so you're seeing also rebellions popping up against pluralism, right? So anti-clericalism is being headed off by the fact that a lot of church figures hold multiple jobs, right? They hold multiple offices and then get paid for all of them at the same time. So you're seeing really wealthy church figures. Now, this is a really big thing. Pluralism and anti-clericalism were also heavily criticized by people in Europe, because if you were the son of a noble, what are your two options for working? You can either be the oldest and inherit noble lands, or you can go off and become a priest and maybe become a bishop and make lots of money. For example, there were two Medici popes at one point, right? That sounds a little ridiculous. The wealthiest family in all of Europe is like using their power and influence to become pope. And we'll talk about one of them in particular, right? And you're seeing like literally the growth of all of this criticism, right? Anti-clerical like ideas and diatribes and pamphlets are going to start popping up where they're accusing priests of being mumblers, of actually basically not knowing Latin, which is super ironic now that I'm actually sitting in like Miss Urso's like theater and stuff like that right now. So like not the ironic in the sense of I don't know any Latin. Like so like now the big thing about it is though they said that basically also something that you need to understand as well saw, if you're looking at me down here in this corner, apparently when they would serve Mass, all the priests had their back turned to the entire audience, and they would face the tabernacle and actually serve Mass. And they would speak everything in Latin, right? The entire Mass was in Latin. And a lot of people were like, do you even know what you're saying? Because they basically said that the people that actually were serving Mass didn't know how to speak Latin either. That they were just sitting up there mumbling, going, blah, 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 blah. They also accused them of being fancy dressers, using this pluralist money to actually buy a lot of rich garb and stuff like that. They called them fornicators, lustful nuns, and accused them of greed. And another big thing that's going to lead serfs, vassals, and even lower classes throughout Europe to accusing clerics of doing wrongdoings is because they never fought in wars, and they never paid taxes, and they owned 30% of the land in most European countries, right? So this is a very big thing that you're seeing, the growth of opposition to these figures that are taking advantage of their power, right? And so getting into it, these conflicts and anger are going to be a big reason why monarchs wanted power to appoint church officials, right? We saw the growth of this concept with the investiture crisis, where literally the monarchs are like, I want to pick my own bishops because I don't trust the bishops that are being appointed by the Pope. So now we're seeing some feuds between the crown. Now we're seeing some feuds between monarchs and how they want church officials to take on civic responsibility. Some of the monarchs are going to begin to demand that like church officials pay certain amounts of taxes. Some monarchs are going to begin to demand all these different things. But here's the problem. Before the Reformation, the Pope could come in and crush these things using his papal suprematic power, right? Papal supremacy, or that power that the Pope has, right? If he ever got angered by a king or a queen, he could just excommunicate them, and they would come crawling back to him. There's a very, very famous example of this with Gregory VII and Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Gregory VII was this super intense pope that told people they had to kiss his feet before they could talk to him, that made all these other insane rules and stuff like that, and really kind of demonstrated the power of a pope if it gets out of hand. And then Henry IV was a king at the time. I was like, dude, I just want to pick my own bishops and stuff like that. And this led to a big feud, and he excommunicates Henry IV and the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire, right? This is in the thing called an interdiction, right? Henry IV, when he's excommunicated, has to come crawling back to prevent his people from rebelling against him, and the Pope forces him to wear a hair shirt, which is like supposed to be like really uncomfortable and itchy and gross and a sign of your shame. A king was being forced to wear an embarrassing symbol by a pope, right? So the thing about it is you're starting to see some feuding between monarchs and some of these other figures in the church, right? We got 2 more slides and then we're done, all right? So the big thing about it, though, that you also need to understand is that we got a lot of intense Reformation politics going on, all right? So in the Holy Roman Empire as well, which is where Martin Luther is from. So we need to understand the political situation in the Holy Roman Empire, which is where Martin Luther was born, where Martin Luther did his living, and where Martin Luther spoke his language, right? He was a German man, and Holy Roman Empire is what you would now call modern-day Germany, right? So who is the ruler of this state where Martin Luther is going to begin the Reformation in its climactic and kind of like schismatic way, right? The ruler is Charles V. Right? Charles V, who is a Habsburg, who is the grandson of Isabella and Ferdinand, nephew of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, right? So the big thing about it is Charles V is the son of Philip the Handsome and Joanna the Mad, right? Joanna the Mad being the only daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, Philip the Handsome being the Holy Roman Empire after Maximilian I, the Habsburg leader, right? So you're going to see like that man, like the Habsburg ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, Philip the Handsome, marry Joanna the Mad, and they're going to then gobble up Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and some areas in Italy. This right here, when Charles V comes to power, is all the land he owned in Europe, which is insane. It's a very large swath of land. Now, really quickly, though, what is his role? Charles V is going to be known as what is the Holy Roman Empire. How did he get this job? Was it given to him basically because his dad was the Holy Roman Empire? No. The reason why he gets the job is because he was selected to get the job, right? There are 7 electors because of this thing called the Golden Bull, which came out in the 1200s, where 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire would choose the Holy Roman Emperor. They would vote on one, right? The 7 electors ruled over different districts of the Holy Roman Empire, and those 7 votes would accrue, and they would decide who the Holy Roman Emperor would be. Well, the Habsburgs had so much money, they would just go out there and bribe 4 of those electors every single time, and that's how they retained the power of the Holy Roman Emperor year after year after year after year. So Charles V was the subject of one of those bribes, right? He was chosen by the electors via those bribes at the age of 19, right? So we have a 19-year-old Charles V now ruling over the Holy Roman Empire, where the Great Reformation is about to happen, okay? So the thing going forward as well that you need to understand, though, is that this is where Luther shows up, right? The complaints against the church were the fuse. Luther was the match. And we will talk about Luther's background and some other different elements when I see y'all in class.